All right. Welcome to The Future is Now, a Zoom communique from your future in the year 2688. My name is Cedar.
And I am Sequoia. And we're historians from your future in the place that you call Humboldt County and that you call 2020. And we call it 2688, or just here and now.
That's right. We are from the future. We are historians who are studying our ancient past, ancient to us being 668 years in the past. But we live in a glorious utopia, as you see behind Sequoia, and we are searching through the historical archive in order to find information about how we got to this place. Why is the world so wonderful and beautiful? And we have made a connection with someone called Rufus, who lives in the year 2020, and we have been able to somehow, through your technology and our modern experience, been able to reach back through time to communicate with you about who were the people doing the work to bring about the glorious utopia that we live in 2688. Who did this work? What were the seeds that were planted in the year that you call 2020, which brought about a time in which everyone gets their needs met without exploiting others and without exploiting themselves? How did we get there? Where did this start? And we have found an interesting pamphlet from your time, which makes reference to a thing you call a web page called The Land Office. And in the Land Office, there were imaginings of how the future would be. And what do you know? It really did turn out the way you expected it.
They were like prophets from your time, laying out what was going to happen in our time, which is really remarkable. And that the Rufus, who we met through a fluke of our technology and who hangs out at the library a lot on the computers, knew exactly where to find this.
So today we have brought a different person in. We have spoken to several of the prophetic individuals from the past or your present to speak with us. And today we have someone from a group called Cooperation Humboldt who is going to speak to us about an effort that he's been involved in around public banking. And so just to start out, let's welcome David to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Cedar and Sequoia. I'm so delighted to be with you. And I'll just take a moment to say that I think your ancestors must have been from Humboldt County, because only in Humboldt County have I met people named Cedar and Sequoia, at least here in our time. So I'll just let you know that if you haven't done your own genealogy, your forebears may well have been from Humboldt County.
It is possible. And you'll see that Cedar right now is engaged in pretending to be one of those forebears from Humboldt County.
I do recognize the Humboldt Crabs baseball cap. I was imagining that perhaps the Crabs have continued for 668 years and the great game of baseball continues to this day, but I can only hope.
We do have a game which is a descendant of baseball. It's interesting. It's a lot more cooperative. People are encouraged to run around the field and get exercise, and there is a sense of accomplishment. But it's really not the subject of tonight's conversation. But it is amazing how sports, as you call them, have evolved over time to be something that is really that brings people together in more ways than just the ways that it did in your time.
Well, I know that we're going to talk about public banking, but I will point out that the people who study our ancient history, which to you must be ancient history, have observed that in many indigenous cultures, they literally don't make a distinction between work, play, and activity. And that the thing that they did for exercise or sport or fun was actually not that competitive either, although there were certain parameters or rules, but mostly it was just to amuse themselves.
Hmm. And I wonder, just looking at what is happening in your time with sports, how much the competitiveness has to do with the monetary gain that is made by certain folks who are engaged in those sports.
You know, Sequoia, I'm glad you asked that question because to continue on the sort of the sports metaphor, I'll say that I myself, growing up, was a huge fan of the sport called baseball, which Cedar has sort of referenced, Cedar and I have referenced. And I really love the game. I still do love the game, but I actually can't really enjoy watching it at the quote professional level anymore, which is really a pity. Not because it's not well played. I mean, the reality is some of the finest human athletes on planet Earth today play in competitive, quote, professional sports, but it's become so monetized and it's become such a sort of a commodity that the joy of just watching the game has been stripped from me. In fact, at our today's public stadiums, I used to live in a place called Houston, Texas, and we had a new stadium built, and I went and I realized that if I put my hands up like this as if they were make-believe binoculars and I looked anywhere except for on the field, right? If I looked anywhere around, there was not a single vantage point that I could look and not see a corporate logo.
These things are confusing to us. As you may have heard, in the future, at our time, we don't deal with money. So tonight, you're going to have to explain to us that we've done some research and we understand that the way that things got done is that people gave what you call money to each other in order, and then people would do stuff or give gifts to each other, but they would have to give them something in order, a piece of.
So Cedar, it both inspires me and is heartbreaking to me to have to explain to you how those transactions worked, because they were in fact transactions. They were not gifts. These things that you've called gifts, when you've tried to imagine, oh, well, people did something and they did gifts in return for one another. I really want to underscore that the entire society that we're currently living in is based upon this thing construct called money, and you did work in exchange for money, and then with that money you then had to buy the things that you needed, like you had to give that money for a place to live called rent or a mortgage if you were fortunate enough to be buying your home. You also had to give some amount of your money for the food that you need to eat. You had to give a certain other amount of money for access to healthcare. In other words, all of the things that you need to survive were actually commodities that were bought and paid for with this thing called money at a profit, which is Sequoia's reference earlier. So everything was done for profit.
And just to clarify, I mean, my understanding, and we've kind of looked into what money has been throughout the ages that it was used. In the year 2020, it seems that it's just made of fiber and paper. The thing itself doesn't have intrinsic value.
That's right. Well, you're correct. And I'm going to really blow your mind, Sequoia, because you're looking at the artifact of that fiber, what we call paper currency. That's only about 0.01% of the total amount of, quote, money that is actually in our current economy in 2020. Over 99% of our money is, in fact, just zeros and ones, digital accounting tricks. Which really underscores that and this I think is important, Cedar and Sequoia, for you in the future to understand that money in our time here in 2020 is nothing but a construct. It's literally a made up idea for how we facilitate trying to organize our society. And our problem from my perspective and those of us at Cooperation Humboldt's perspective is that we have created this thing called an economy and putting people in service of the abstraction known as an economy, rather than saying, oh, if by economy you mean how goods and services are going to be allocated, that should be to benefit the people and then protecting the planet that we depend upon as part of our ecosystem, right? So in our time, we've literally got it ass backwards, or that's ass backwards is a clip. Maybe that's too colloquial for y'all. But
Oh,
the
no,
point
we'd love
is,
to learn those.
yeah, okay, so
yeah.
yeah, so in other words, we've just got it wrong in my opinion. And Cedar, your question underscores to me that it feels like the future, like my descendants figured it out, that like really, like what we should do is create a society where everybody's needs are met, and that we actually spend our time self-actualizing. And it's and maybe I'll test it out, because I have, and we at Cooperation Humboldt have a theory that what actually people really want is not just accumulating strips of fabric or this thing called money. That we don't even really want a lot of stuff. What we want is meaningful human connection. We want to do meaningful, productive work for which we will be acknowledged and respected and appreciated. That's actually what people want. And in my time, we have been told a lie by folks who are hoarding those pieces of paper or those zeros and ones digitally into believing that we have to compete with one another, and that we have to exploit and oppress one another. And in fact, that we have to be willing to risk destroying the very planet we depend upon in order to get more of that imaginary construct called money.
Again, with the competition.
Yeah, yeah, I think, and that's the thing, Sequoia, in our time, everything is about competing, because there's this idea that everything is scarce and that you have to compete and try to get over and dominate other people and other systems and other peoples in order to get an advantage for yourself. That's the world that we're currently living in.
Well, let me just say, I think one thing will be clear is that you know, the changes that happened that brought us to our glorious utopia that we live in now, it didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of work to get here, and we've done research, and we understand that you had to change the system and the way that you interacted with money in order to get to the place where it was no longer relevant. And so I want to ask you a question and to try to understand what public banking exactly is. And then the reason I'm in front of a baseball field is because in our time, when we want to build a baseball field, or what we call baseball, what we do now, we all gather the community and say, we're going to do this on this day. Somebody takes charge and says, hey, this is how I want to do it. And then everybody kind of like works together, and we all show up and build it together. Somebody who has, you know, specialized knowledge comes and works, and we organize all this. But I understand from what you're explaining to me that in the past, if you wanted to build a park, then you'd have to get some money, and maybe your community doesn't have enough money to build it. So what do you do when you don't have enough money to build something like a park? What do you have to do?
You have to borrow it. And it is, borrowing is the concept that says, I need some of this imaginary construct called money to do the things that we need to do. So borrowing it means that you don't have it now, but you pledge to pay it back if you let me use it now. Oh, and by the way, I have to pay you what we call interest, which is if it takes 100 units to build this thing, and I don't have any, then I borrow 100 units, but I have to pledge to pay back usually 200 units. So just the privilege of borrowing this imaginary thing called money, especially for public infrastructure projects in our time, usually literally doubles the cost of it. So
how did anything get built in your time? I mean, I think we've understood, we've researched this, and it's this thing called usury, right?
Yes.
There's a fee, and it's like your religious things even say that it's not a good thing. I don't get it. I don't get why would somebody pay twice as much for a park when you could just go build it?
Okay with that. Why don't people refuse to do it?
Well, Cedar and Sequoia, I ask myself this question all the time. So I will tell you that your frustration, your confusion, your sort of like what I would call righteous indignation about hearing how this is how things work is something that we at Cooperation Humboldt experience every day. Only it's even worse because for a lot of folks, people have been so indoctrinated into the idea of money and into the idea of profit and the idea that people are competitive rather than cooperative, that many folks actually just assume that that is just, quote, the way it is and that things can't change. So Sequoia and Cedar, I want to sort of circle back to this notion that, Cedar was describing, well, when we want something publicly done, we just want something done, we just organize the people, and the people with the skills come and offer their gifts. And so it sounds to me like it's simply a question of whether the idea is a good enough idea and you can persuade or inspire other people to participate. Like, that's how y'all are getting it done. Sadly, and that's the world that we're trying to build at Cooperation Humboldt, but it's not the world that we live in now. So we also know, as Cedar pointed out, that it didn't happen overnight to get from the world of 2020 to the glorious utopia you're living in. And so public banking was a way to begin to shift the paradigm around money itself. Because Cedar, I saw you when I was describing how, like, you borrowed money, and then for infrastructure you had to pay back interest, usury. Usually it doubled the quote cost of that money, how outrageous that was. Well, public banking is a way to take that whole concept of banking outside the private domain and put it in the public domain. In current times, in 2020, virtually all banking, all except for one bank in the entire United States, are what are called private banks. So this thing called money, the construct that our entire society sort of revolves around, is actually controlled by private interests. You may have, yes, Sequoia.
How did they get that money to begin with?
Well, they basically stole it from the rest of us, to be very blunt. You've no doubt come across the shameful legacy of slavery in your studies, in your explorations. We called it chattel slavery, and chattel just means like livestock. So treating human beings like livestock and horrifically taking the human labor as your own. There is now something called wage labor, where in order to get people to do things that they don't want to do, rather than inspire and persuade them that they're good ideas to do projects, we live in a current society where they've basically locked up all the food. They have put up gates and fences and enclosed what our ancestors called the commons, and they charge us rent to literally occupy places. They force us to pay money for the food that we need to survive. And so the way that they are accumulating the money is by creating a system that incentivizes the exploitation and oppression of other workers. So rather than simply inspire people to want to do work, to do good, you extract labor by saying, if you don't have money, you won't have food to eat, you won't have a place to be able to live. So they really have got us in cages that are mental cages, because folks have not yet just sort of risen up to say, we won't do this anymore.
So you're saying this public bank is one way that people are rising up to change the way that you interact with money and avoid this interest?
That's right. That's right, Cedar, because a public bank, remember, because I know it's confusing because money is just a construct, but it is very real. There are lots of other constructs in our time, right? We say gender is a construct. It's just made up. And in our current time, there's usually, well, when I was coming up as a child, people only thought that there were two genders. Now they're recognizing that there are multiple genders because they're constructs. But you can't say, oh, gender is just a construct and ignore it, because it's quite real, right? Just because it's imaginary and made up doesn't mean it's not real. In our time, race is a construct. It doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, sadly, there was a person with pigment different than mine killed again by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota just yesterday, clearly because of the construct of their gender, of their skin color. So I'm just pointing out that just because something's a construct doesn't mean it does not have profound, real implications.
I could see how the money would have this construct. Yeah, it sounds like it really has a grip on everybody's mind, and they're really living with it. So, but so you have to work with it somehow.
You have to work with it. But what we've done, a group of us have convinced our elected officials, and that's another thing, right? Rather than just collectively make decisions and you have to convince everybody, we have a system in which you elect certain people and give them quite a bit of authority and power, actually, about making some rules. But we've convinced those elected officials to allow an experiment called public banking. And a public bank is one that's owned and operated not for the private gain and for the benefit of the shareholders of that bank, but instead owned and operated by the public. And the entire idea would be that it is a way to democratize money itself. And so, for example, if a public park needed to be built in Eureka, California, or Humboldt County, California, rather than go to a private bank and beg for the privilege of borrowing money and then have to pay it back, plus the interest, which would basically double the cost, that the public institution would simply say, okay, it's just an accounting trick anyway. We've got on deposit money from the existing county and city governments, so we'll just put that imaginary money to work building that public infrastructure project, and there's no shareholders that you have to pay back at a profit, so it greatly reduces the so-called interest associated with those infrastructure projects.
That sounds really smart.
It is, right? It's very common sense. And I'm very excited to share with y'all that not only is California now created state law to allow the creation of local and regional banks, but we're working with our current governor, Governor Newsom, to explore creation of a state public bank. And breaking news, I just got off the phone. I have the honor of serving on a newly formed National Public Banking Alliance. And we are working with Representative Tlaib and also Representative Octavio Cortez to introduce federal national banking that would make federal monies available to create both local and state public banks. So this idea is beginning to really gather a lot of momentum, and we have, so it's actually quite exciting times for us, because this shift around how to think about money, how to think about banking is really beginning.
Purely from a linguistic standpoint, I'm intrigued by the word interest, and that being used for what you're describing it as, because in our time, interest is, it's something that I would show if I were curious. I have an interest in understanding the sport of baseball that you see.
So I'm so glad that you brought that up, Sequoia, because in our time as well, there are actually two definitions of interest. The first is the state of curiosity or wanting to learn or know about something. And the second is money paid at a rate of return for the privilege of using money in the current time. So we actually have two ways to describe interest. Here's something else. When we talk about value today, there can usually, or values, there might be a definition around values that are like the things that you hold dear, such as honesty, integrity, beauty, compassion. Those are called values. There's another way to think about value, and that is how much money does something cost? So, Cedar, your point about it seems like money has a grip on everything. So, like things like interest and value have one way of terminology, one way of talking about them that have to do with much more core fundamental ideas. But in our time today in 2020, interest and value also have very strong economic or money-laden terminology. That's and we believe at Cooperation Humboldt that we should treat any human need as if it's a right, that we have a right to enough food to eat, we have a right to a place to live, we have a right to education and healthcare, we have a right to art and culture, because we know that art and culture are not just add-ons, that they are actually human needs. So we treat all human needs as rights, and that our social contract should be collectively we take care of each other. We are by nature, we think, cooperative, and we're trying to create mechanisms, whether it's public banking or housing cooperatives or worker owner cooperatives. We're trying to create in the 2020 right now mechanisms that incentivize love, compassion, kindness, and cooperation, where the rest of broader society today, our legal system, our political system, and our economic system is actually privileging, incentivizing greed, exploitation, and oppression of others. So we're in a difficult time in 2020.
I want you to know, however, though it does seem like you have a lot to work against, and we can't say too much because of the space-time continuum, but it pays off, David. It pays off.
Well, thank you. I'm getting tears in my eyes sort of imagining it, because it is a lot of work. But I also, for folks who may be listening to this communique, want to really underscore that at Cooperation Humboldt, our work is joyful work, right? It's not drudgery. And in fact, I have a friend who's a linguist who has told me, I haven't personally vouched or verified this, but she was telling me that the word work, the very root of that word, comes from meaningful, productive human activity, right? And so saying it that way, everybody wants to work. Everybody wants to do meaningful, productive activity for which they will be respected, appreciated, acknowledged, right? But that the word job, which today is often interchangeable, she said, oh, but a job in its original form was actually a sort of slur or an insult, because you had to sell your labor to somebody else and they told you what to do, rather than you being empowered to choose what you do with your time. So this notion of work, even hard work can be quite joyful if you really believe it to be meaningful and productive. And I do feel that we at Cooperation Humboldt are doing meaningful and productive work, and it need not be drudgery. And that in fact, it can be quite fun, and it can be quite playful. And we can enjoy each other's company, and we can spend time singing and dancing and doing baseball.
Absolutely.
Oh, did you learn that one?
I did.
Yes, that means okay.
Yes.
Nice. Well, yes, we've been exploring many of your traditions and cultural activities, doing our cat's play to dress up in the manner of the folks. What's that, Sequoia?
He never gets it right. He never gets it right. It's cosplay.
Well, I wear the costumes, yes, of your time period, and dress up to amuse ourselves. And we do have a good time here in the future. We really enjoy that, and the work we do. Yeah, we still call it the work. It's hard, building a baseball field, but it's also fun.
Yeah, right. And again, to me, it's like I have the privilege of having a garden, and it is work to plant the seeds and cultivate and tend it. But it's also very pleasant work, and of course, harvesting the fruits of that labor is quite delicious as well.
Well, thank you for tending the garden. That is the year 2020.
Well, thank you. It's good to know it pays off.
Yeah.
Yes, the thousands of members of Cooperation. Wait, I'm sorry. Is it 2020? The hundreds of members of Cooperation Humboldt of your time are doing great work, which will come to fruition in the future. And I understand Rufus wants us to keep the show short and so that he can rebroadcast it in different venues. So we are going to say thank you very much to David Cobb from Cooperation Humboldt, who is explaining what the work they're doing, particularly in the area of public banking in California, what you call California, and the other work that they're doing in the year 2020. And as you know, in the future, things turn out great. Sequoia, did you have anything else to ask Mr. Cobb?
I mean, I have all sorts of questions about bananas because we don't have them here in our time, but that's going to have to wait for another conversation. Though Rufus is saying, that we've had some watchers out there in the internet land, in the interwebs. They got caught in our web and have really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, the internet is a series of tubes, as you'll discover if you do the research. And if we're signing off, I really wanted to do this since you're from the future. If we're signing off, I want to say, be excellent to each other.
Did you know?
Party on, dude.
Party on.
Party on.